Hello, world. Welcome to DevOps Days Kansas City. We're going to have Matthew Boeckman, a returning speaker from last year, broadcast out to All Day DevOps. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Matthew Boeckman.
Hi, everybody. Thank you very much for coming today. I am excited to get to address this audience and the all-day DevOps audience for my second year in a row. And I hope you enjoy my talk, Useful Flakes, the Value of Common Tools. Just to get us started, this is me. I'm the VP of Engineering at a company called Blueprint. We're at myblueprint.com. I've got about 19 years leading dev and operations teams. It's awkward to say that next month that has to tick over to 20, but this is the last time everyone will see 19. It's very exciting for me. I'm a startup advisor. I'm at Matthew Boeckman on Twitter, and I'm an amateur Flint Knapper. Can I see by show of hands all the other Flint Knappers in the audience? Awesome. So for the record, for the live stream, there's not a single hand up and an awful lot of really awkward glances, which makes me feel awesome. So Flint Knapping is the practice of making stone tools in the way of our Paleolithic ancestors. Just by way of introduction, from left and moving clockwise, that's a piece of rock. That's actually an evaculite. It's really good for this activity. Then I have some pumice. This is like an abrader. We used to sort of file the rocks. The next two are antler and copper billets that we use for strike, for percussion flaking, for hitting the rocks. And the last three over here are points. The one is a copper point, and the next two are deer antlers. And we use these literally to push chunks of the rock off and to do fine work. At the bottom are some of the artifacts that I have made, which, as you can see, are probably not lethal, but maybe enough to potentially scare a deer or give a rabbit some anxiety. As I said, I'm not particularly good at this hobby, but I really enjoy it. Here's a nice gift to kind of illustrate the process where we start with an unformed piece. We work around the corners to try and create what's called a preform, and then ideally, with one final strike, we break off something actually useful. We actually create a useful flake. So normally at this point in the talk, I need to explain a little bit why I'm interested in Flint Knapping, because obviously, given the audience reaction, not a lot of cloud systems architects and microservice engineers are also interested in rocks. In my spare time, I'm a keen fan of history and anthropology, and over the years I've become really interested in this period in Earth's history, the last glacial maximum, colloquially known as the Ice Age. This is a period of around 31,000 to 16,000 years before present, when the average global temperature was around 12 degrees Celsius colder than it is today. As you all know from school, glaciers covered most of the continents. North America, Asia, and Europe were just covered with glaciers and snow. There was massive deforestation, desertification, and drought all around the world. Areas that had for millennia been bountiful were now barren wastelands. During this time, most of the megafauna died off. There was a pretty significant amount of species extinctions. Mammoths, mastodons, cave bears, giant sloths, saber-toothed tigers, the Neanderthals all failed to make it through this period. But we did. As a species, our species survived this global catastrophe, and we really only had our brains. This thing, which is the original killer app, this is an opposable thumb, very cool. We had fire, which is important, and we had these rocks that I'm so interested in. And I want to just take a second and kind of show you some of the tools that your ancestors used to survive this catastrophe. These are some knives. These are reproductions. These are not mine. These are far too good. But you can see it's just a bit of rock on the tip of an antler. That's an axe. That's an actual axe from the Stone Age. This is a burin. This is kind of a drill. You use this to poke holes in hide or to maybe drill into bone. And that's a spear point. This is a Clovis point that some of you might be familiar with in picture and maybe in name. And what I really want to draw your attention to about these tools is they're not very good. Speaking as somebody who works with these rocks all the time, they're fragile, they're brittle, they break easily, they're infuriating. And every one of you, I am certain, has a better example of a knife at home than anything I've just shown you. If you gave me a choice between the rocks that I just showed you and your worst kitchen knife and asked me to survive in the wilderness, I will take your kitchen knife every day. Being an engineer, this has been like a record scratch in my mind. How did we get through this catastrophe with a bunch of junk fueling our species? And the reality is despite these really imperfect tools, we had incredible results. Everything that I've got listed up here was necessary for us, not only to sort of do okay at, but to absolutely just kill it for us to get through this time. And we didn't just barely scrape by during the last glacial maximum. We evolved cognitively. Going into this period, subjective representation didn't exist. Drawing a picture and having that picture have meaning beyond just it being some lines in the dirt. And language, which I think we can all appreciate, both of these are fairly critical parts to everything that has come after. All of our civilization exists because we developed subjective representation in language during the Ice Age. When you think about ancient or primitive societies, you often have to understand them through calorie intake. Do you have enough calories to survive? First checkbox. Do you have enough calories to expand your population? Next checkbox. Do you have enough calories to actually think, to grow, to evolve what your society or your tribe or your civilization is doing? Third checkbox. We checked all three with these really not very good tools. So this has been the thing that's fueled my interest and fascination with this time and these rocks. And I've tried to riddle out what is it about them, despite their relative crapulence, that really set us up for success. And I want to talk about four values of tools that I think are embodied by this technology complex. And I'm going to use that phrase a lot. And I want to really drive home that this was humans' first touch with technology. All of you today, as engineers, exist because of the engineers who sat around in the frozen wastelands starting our relationship with technology. So these values that I want us to talk about, they're accessible, they're flexible, they're ubiquitous, and they empower innovation. I want to pull up. I'm going to warn you right now, I'm not going to talk about Kubernetes, we're not going to talk about AWS or Jenkins for the rest of my talk. We're going to talk about tools in the abstract and how we think about them as engineers. So the first thing I want us to talk about is accessibility. During this time, all members of a tribe were tool makers. I like to joke that I'm almost as skilled as a Paleolithic 10-year-old. Children, adults, men, women, everyone was involved in the daily activities necessary to sustain life, including the manufacture and use of tools. The raw materials, those rocks, can be transformed in very short order into something useful that the tribe can get utility out of. And they're easily taught without verbal or written instruction. I taught my 3-year-old how to Flint Knap. As a humorous thought exercise, despite saying I wasn't going to say anything about Kubernetes, like imagine, if you will, explaining Kubernetes to one of your coworkers without verbal or written instructions. Get back to me if you figure out how to do that. The next thing I want to talk about is ubiquitous. As you've probably noticed, rocks are like everywhere. This is a fairly rocky planet. And you think about the kind of climate change that I described that was occurring at this time, this was absolutely critical. Our species, our predecessors, had to wander far and wide to find new sources of food. We had to go out on long hunting expeditions, and as we threw our spears at the reindeer, and they broke because the spear points are terrible, we had to be able to recreate them. If we were not using a ubiquitous technology complex, we simply don't survive the Ice Age. This was one of the critical failings, I think, of the Neanderthals, that they hadn't adopted a more ubiquitous technology that allowed them to range far and wide. The third thing I want us to consider is flexibility. So this is a picture of the knives that I showed you earlier, but that same knife can be retasked as a spear point. It can be used to scrape. It can be used to drill. The archaeological record shows us innumerable examples where a particular tool started life as one thing and was reused in various different roles as it broke or chipped or wore through time. And if you bring back briefly to the comment I made about calorie intake, this is where this value really drives home. The less time we spent creating and recreating tools, the more time we were able to spend thinking, growing, and surviving. The last value is empowering innovation. And I know that everybody showed up today to hear about the latest in lithic technology. We don't usually think about like rocks and innovation in the same sentence. But this is really, I think for me, the meat of why these tools helped us evolve the way we did. As you're working with this medium, you inevitably make a lot of mistakes. I make most of the things that I do are mistakes. And often if I'm trying to create one shape, I will strike incorrectly and I will get a different shape. And that actually might be better than what I was trying to do in the first place. That basic relationship with the medium enabled us to experiment and to have feedback for our next iteration. We call those accidents when we make them useful flakes. But this familiarity with that technology complex forms the basic underpinning of our cognitive approach to learning today. We were innovating. We took this technology complex to its zenith during the Ice Age because of our ability to experiment, learn, adapt, change, and innovate on that technology. It has been a lifelong dream to use this picture in a contextually relevant moment, and I'd like to thank you all for checking off a bucket list item with me. So we're going to advance now. I'm done talking about mastodons and saber-toothed tigers. We're going to talk about 2018. And the thing that I want to really discuss is the relationship between specialized and generalized tools that we all live. There's a healthy tension, I'm sure, in all of our teams. We have a debate. Should we choose something highly specialized, or should we take something maybe less so? And I think, as engineers, we tend to have this bias towards specialization, right? We want the best tool for the job. I'm personally guilty. I have, I think, 63 screwdrivers at home. I probably need 7, but I have one for every possible imaginable use of a screwdriver. And this is okay. This is effectively what we are supposed to do as a tool-using species and a tool-using culture, is find specialization. But I think that there's a lot of penalty when we over-specialize, and that's what I'd like to talk to you about. A couple of examples of over-specialization in my own experience. This is a team. All these teams will remain nameless. About 40 engineers across 5 Scrum teams, and they had adopted 5 separate workflow systems to manage their reality. Now, each team would tell you that they were using the best workflow system for them, and that's awesome. That's really great. But if you were trying to help out a different team, if you were trying to understand what was going across the team as a whole, it was an effective disaster, highly specialized. This example always gives me like acute anxiety. 75 engineers, 60 microservices, 12 different data stores, and no dedicated data team. The paradigm that created this was one of innovation. The developers were encouraged to choose whatever technology seemed best when they created a new microservice. And without any governance around that, what they created was effectively an unmanageable disaster. But they were highly specialized. So I want to talk about this now in the context of these values that I introduced a minute ago: empowering innovation, ubiquitous, flexible, and accessible. And I'm going to go in kind of reverse order. The first thing I want you to consider is that tools, when they are at their best, free us from toil. Quick show of hands, who's read the Google SRE book? Okay, for everybody whose hand isn't up, stop what you're doing after the conference, pick that up and read it. There's a very thoughtful essay on toil, which is effectively you having to do meticulous tasks that could or should be automated. The more your team is toiling, the less you are innovating. Common tools, tools that are less specialized, allow our teams to focus on product and feature innovation instead of focusing on disparate tool implementations and maintenance. Stated differently, generalized or common tools set us up to empower the right kind of innovation in our teams. In a specialized tool environment, the product innovation suffers as attention's paid to maintaining that different tooling. If you think back to my 12 data stores example, every one of those different technologies has a different upgrade, disaster recovery, backup, scale, security path, and every one of those is a special one-off use case the team has to deal with, which means they're not focused on what they're actually there to do, which is ideally innovate around a product. The next thing I want you to consider is that tools, when they're at their best, enable a flow state or set our teams up to experience a flow state. Again, show of hands, like flow state, is that a word that folks are familiar with a little bit? So you're in the zone. You have no meetings for the next 3 hours. The Slack icon isn't bouncing. Your email is caught up. You've got your headphones on, and you're able to just focus and jam. That is a flow state. That is the highest cognitive function that a human being can experience. And the more that you can achieve that at work, everybody's had those days when you can just like focus and jam. The more you get, the more productivity you have. And so tools are at the best when they enable that. And to me, flexible tools are the right approach to enable a flow state. Bad news, multitasking is a lie. Anytime you have a task that involves more than one tool, you are context switching. That context switch is the death, or at least threatening the death, of your flow state. So flexible tools are often suboptimal for specific tasks. I think of this argument and this discussion happening in almost every engineering team I've ever worked with, where there's an argument to use something specialized because it is better at accomplishing the task we're describing. But I want you to consider that every time you make that choice, you're trading off by accepting more cognitive load for yourself and your team, and you're reducing that flow state that we should be optimizing for. Our ancestors sort of stumbled into this accidentally, but W. Edwards Deming, I think, really codified it well with this quote: "To optimize the whole, we must often sub-optimize the parts." And as an engineer, like this makes almost all of us uncomfortable. If we sit down and we're like, all right, team, let's sub-optimize today, everybody's going to cringe and rightly run away. But we have to be mindful of that interplay between optimization of the whole versus hyper-specialization and optimization of the parts, and the cost that comes, the cost that creates for us to pay. So on the topic of bad news, we're not likely to colonize a planet made of CI/CD pipelines, resilient microservices, or scalable cloud computing anytime soon. It's an infinite universe. You never know, right? So we need to find a different definition of ubiquitous as we think about DevOps tooling in 2018. And for me, this is a value that really speaks to how widely adopted the technology or the tool you're discussing is. Is it 5 of your team of 60 who are going to use this? Are there 6 contributors to the GitHub community? When you have broad adoption of a technology complex, what that really means is you have people at all different skill levels using it, learning from each other, teaching each other, interoperating in ways that you just don't get when you have limited tool adoption. It is only that rich community that can enable the most productivity from a given platform. I think talking about ubiquitous as a value, we can know it sometimes by its opposite, and XKCD has set me up really well here. I'll let you all read that for a second. We've all been this stick figure at one time or another, right? We have to, as DevOps engineers and as practitioners in 2018, use really bleeding edge stuff. We've got to experiment. We've got to try new approaches and new tools and technologies. And by definition, those tools and technologies are not ubiquitous yet. We find ourselves in this position probably more than we like to admit. I've been there more times than I want to think about. But this is, I think, really speaks to the point I'm making about ubiquitous tool adoption. The more you optimize for that specialized and highly innovative tool set, the more you'll find yourself alone on the bleeding edge and looking for help and looking for support. The last thing I want you to consider is that tools have a very siloing effect on our teams. If you're playing DevOps bingo, there was a Deming's quote, and here is a picture of a grain silo, so you're well on your way to getting your bingo. If you don't, this maybe is apparent, maybe it isn't, but tools creating silos, I am certain that later today, a few of you are going to have an interaction, and one of you are going to say, oh yeah, we use Ansible, and somebody else is going to say, we use Terraform. Those guys, right? Vim and Emacs, you can think of dozens of different ways that tools create barriers for us. If nothing else, interoperability. I don't know that tool set. It makes it harder for me to participate in that team's reality. I'm not comfortable with that tool set. I don't believe in it. I think that team has errors because of the tools they chose. The more we have differentiated tooling in our teams, the more we create silos. And DevOps, as I think we all know, is really about trying to break down organizational barriers. As a first approximation, that's what it was. Let's let developers and operators talk together. Let's have them work together in a collaborative way. And where we haven't quite advanced the tape yet is how tools impact and detract from that vision. So the thing I want you to consider is that all members of a DevOps tribe should be using a common tool set. This is where we get all of the benefits that I stated earlier around ubiquity, flexibility, and empowering innovation. Perhaps most importantly, new practitioners of a tool set have to be welcomed and not stigmatized. This idea of accessibility is one that I think is extremely topical in 2018 as our country and our society is wrestling with all sorts of new definitions of accessibility for people of different backgrounds. And I think that in at least my own experience of DevOps, stigmatizing new practitioners is a fairly common practice. If you Google me hard enough, it's embarrassing to admit, you'll find some Usenet posts where I absolutely flame some noobs on an Ascend mailing list because they didn't know how dial-up modems worked. It's not a particularly proud moment for me to admit that, but it's, I think, illustrative of my point. as folks are learning, as you have novices coming into the tool set that you've chosen, you have to pave the way for them and make it easy for them to pick up this technology complex. That's how you can be successful with tooling in a DevOps context in 2018. So those are my 4 values that I think speak to the importance of common or generalized tools over specialization. Again, this tension will always exist in our practice. Where's the right place to use specialization, and where should we try to get the benefit of a common platform? These values, in my interpretation, helped us not only survive but thrive during the last glacial maximum, but I think can be critical to your success as DevOps practitioners in 2018. I'm Matthew Boeckman. Thank you very much for your time. I hope you enjoyed it.